Further debate, I recognize the member from Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have my chance finally to speak to Bill 163, the Supporting Ontario's First Responders Act in terms of post-traumatic stress 2016. I'd like to also take the opportunity to welcome leadership from Ontario Provincial Police Association, the Police Association of Ontario, and the Ontario Provincial Firefighters Association. Welcome to Queen's Park, and thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit disappointed to have to condense my remarks. I had a full 20, of course, but with time allocation, I've had to condense that down to 10 minutes and unfortunately leave out many of the voices I was hoping to bring with me today to this conversation. First, I'm pleased to recognize the tireless and committed advocacy and heart that my colleague from Parkdale High Park, Sherry DeNovo, has invested for years to bring awareness and support to workers, to our first responders when it comes to mental health and PTSD. So again, thank you to Sherry for the work that she has done on their behalf for 7 years until Bill 2 this session. Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege to act as the NDP Critic for Community Safety and Correctional Services. I'm pleased to rise today and share not only my thoughts but the voices of first responders. The strength of the frontline workers who have shared their stories with Ontario does so much to not only educate but to break down the stigma surrounding mental health struggles. We need all of those who suffer from PTSD to have the support they need, and this bill will allow first responders with a PTSD diagnosis to get a fast pass through the WSIB system because their diagnosis will be presumed to be a result of on-the-job trauma. This is huge. I would like to remind the legislature of some of what Minister Flynn said in his remarks. He had explained, quote, "Under our current system, a worker that's suffering from traumatic mental stress that has a diagnosis such as PTSD must prove to the WSIB that the injury is, in fact, work-related. What this often asks the individual to do is relive the incident, sometimes over and over and over again, as the evidence is being collected. That could have the impact of actually increasing the trauma that's associated with the disorder." End quote. The parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Labour also referred to this arduous WSIB process and called it, quote, "an inquisition." Mr. Speaker, I'm reminding the government of their own words and their own convictions, because here we have a piece of legislation that will affect almost all of our first responders, but specifically leaves out a handful. Effectively, by ruling them out, this government is admittedly keeping them in the WSIB inquisition line, which can re-traumatize, and that is wrong, and it's avoidable. Speaker, I met Correctional Officer Eric Hunting at one of the first jails that I visited. He suffers from PTSD that made itself manifest after a brutal and traumatizing incident with a ceramic knife, a knife that can only be detected by scanners that haven't been put in jails yet. I asked him about his experience through the system, and I'd like to share what he told me about the system. Quote, "Now that I have the doctor's note and the psych report saying that I have the diagnosis, that it was a workplace injury, it's been very easy to deal with. Getting approved was difficult. Proving that the mental injury came from work and not outside of work was difficult to prove. They went through my entire life and were trying to find something else in my childhood or my past that could have triggered the PTSD so that they could decide it wasn't work. I kept second-guessing because the threat of this situation wasn't at me. The inmate wasn't trying to stab me. They were saying you weren't directly assaulted and it wasn't directed at you. Then why did that incident make you feel the way it did? The awful thing is that I didn't ask to feel that way. Trust me, I didn't ask to be put in that position, and I would have traded it for anything to not feel that way. And now I have to explain why I feel the way I do." End quote. Mr. Speaker, this is not a process that any of our emergency responders should ever have to endure. Speaker, during the winter intersession, I visited 15 jails and correctional centres across the province and half a dozen probation and parole offices. I could talk for days about what I have learned, and any time the minister would like a comprehensive briefing, I would be more than pleased to arrange one. But for today, I think it more important to hear from our first and constant responders in corrections. You will remember that there was a violent hostage-taking at the Thunder Bay Jail that stretched through the night. Murray Butler was the correctional officer taken hostage, but not the only officer forever affected. I promised Murray that I would share some of his words today. He said, "Life in Thunder Bay changed for a lot of people on the evening of December 7th, and we are all trying to cope with things in our own way. I am dealing with my own symptoms of PTSD, such as anxiety, nightmares, guilt, recurring unwanted memories, reliving the trauma, flashbacks, inability to sleep, and even thoughts of suicide. The list goes on and on. Unfortunately, I am not the only correctional officer or first responder that is dealing with PTSD as a result of this riot and hostage-taking. I can only hope the best for them. I also know that there are many other COs and first responders across the province that have had to deal with traumatic events and are suffering from PTSD. That is why I was overjoyed when I heard that corrections were recognized as part of the PTSD bill. I was very fortunate the night of the riot and hostage-taking to be supported by a group of professionals whom I know without a doubt saved my life. I am so grateful to the people and groups who also donated to the GoFundMe campaign, and it allowed me and my family to go on a vacation. It was truly humbling. I hope that this government wakes up and does everything in its power to ensure that my brothers and sisters have a safe place to work. Cheers, Murray. Speaker, the government included corrections in this bill, but then arbitrarily crossed off some of the officers on the list. So this is from a letter written by Greg Arnold, a provincial bailiff and MERC team member who was a correctional officer before being a bailiff and has worked for MCSCS for 33 years. He says, there are 30 classified bailiffs in Ontario that are assigned to various institutions, and there are not enough of us to do the work. Our bailiffs are critical incident stress managers, ISIT members, and incident negotiators. By the definition of the bill for correctional officers, we meet and exceed the duties and responsibilities. In order to compete to become a bailiff, you must first be a correctional officer. Our department is comprised of some of the most experienced correctional officers. We have been involved in accidents on the highway where our members have provided emergency first aid to members of the public and offenders. Many times we have been first responders on fatal accidents and have not only done our role but have taken control of scenes and provided emergency services. If this bill passed as written, you can have 2 correctional staff working the same traumatic incident. One would be covered under this bill, the other would be out in the cold. This omission is a huge injustice to the dedicated staff that are correctional officers but are classified as bailiffs. Speaker, the Police Association of Ontario also feels this bill ought to be broadened to include special constables and others. I know that we will have the chance to discuss this during committee, but basically it does not make sense to leave bailiffs and special constables out of this legislation. Another group that has been inappropriately excluded are probation and parole officers. Danielle is an officer, and I would be pleased to share her words. Danielle says, I have been a probation and parole officer for 10 years. In 1 year, I lost 5 clients to overdose and suicide. Every year, usually around the Christmas holidays, I receive phone calls from clients who are suicidal and attempting to kill themselves. I have witnessed victims of domestic violence, battered, bleeding, and bruised as they've attended my office unannounced and in crisis. I have listened to young children sobbing as they've disclosed sexual abuse at the hands of a family member. I have coaxed car keys out of the hands of a client who was so high on opiates that he was disrobing in my office to scratch the lesions that covered his torso. I sat across from a client who had sewn a stab wound on his neck together with shoelaces. I attended a home visit to deliver bad news to a client when moments after I left, he shot himself. I remember thinking to myself, what if he had turned the gun on me? I have been stalked. I have found sexually suggestive notes on my car windshield as it sat in my work parking lot. I have had to sit with the Justice Official Protection and Intelligence Service while they educated me about how to safeguard my home and worksite to protect myself from threatening clients and stalkers. I've had clients pull knives out of their socks and waistbands on several occasions. If I, as a probation officer, have not been exposed to trauma, please tell me how you would define my experiences. While I have been fortunate enough not to develop PTSD as a result of my experiences, I have not walked away unscathed. The accumulation of these events means that I will now battle an anxiety disorder for the rest of my life. It is difficult to share this admission, but at a time where probation officers are being denied mental health support and have been excluded from legislation that can assist them in securing adequate treatment for post-traumatic stress, I felt it necessary. While I continue to love my job, it has most certainly come at a cost. Please do the right thing and ensure our inclusion in PTSD legislation. Speaker, this shouldn't be an argument about the label of first responder because this legislation is meant to support those who need it most. So I would challenge this government to figure out who experiences trauma the most and cover them. Consider all frontline workers and broaden the reach of presumptive coverage. All 911 communicators, not just dispatchers. Police investigative support and forensic staff, nurses, children's aid workers, Ministry of Labour inspectors are among others to consider and support. They, like so many others, need support and care. Factor them in, please. If you won't do it in this bill, then see this bill as the first step in the journey to supporting mental health needs across Ontario. They look after us. We need to look after them. And considering all that our first responders do for us, the least we can do is get the legislation right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.